So it says we're live and recording, so I'll believe it. Welcome to our virtual event at the Bookmark. We're getting closer to the days that we can have wonderful people like Mort Crim and you all in the store. But for now, we're going to stay virtual to keep everybody safe. And the great part about this is that you can watch at home and you can be, eating dinner, sipping your glass of wine or cup of coffee and in your PJs. And you can watch this next week, tell your friends about it, and watch it again or see it for the first time with somebody else. So we're very excited to have Mort Crim here. I met him yesterday because he nicely came into the store and signed some books for us. So we have signed copies of his wonderful book, Anchored, for you to purchase. And I think that the most compelling part about him when you hear it will be his voice, because while he's wonderful to look at, he just has this amazing voice. It sounds like you're hearing a message from on high. So I want to welcome you, Mort. Thank you so much. And obviously the first question is, what compelled you to write this wonderful story about Anchored, about your life as an anchorman on television, radio? You've done everything. You've won every award, been inducted into halls of fame, print media, television, and the radio. So I turn it over to you. It's your story to tell, not mine.
Well, the impetus for the book, or the inspiration that I got for starting the book, is explained in the introduction to the book, and I'll try to condense that rather than take the pages that were involved in writing it. Will Ferrell, who starred in and co-wrote the Anchorman movies, played the part of Ron Burgundy, the airheaded, ditzy anchorman, revealed in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine that he had gotten the idea for this parody by watching old videotapes of Jessica Savage and me when we were co-anchoring the news on KYW in Philadelphia. Once that word got out, once Will made that public, then I started getting inundated with telephone calls and requests to do interviews with people like CNN and Fox and Friends and Good Morning America. Everybody wanted to know, what is it like for a serious journalist to be tagged as the inspiration for a buffoon in the movies? And my standard response was, I can laugh at myself and my profession, and as long as they were doing a parody, and I told Will this when I met him at the premiere of Anchorman 2, I said, if you'd build this as a documentary, I'd really be pissed. But I said, as a comedy, as a parody, as a satire, we all have to be able to laugh at ourselves. And I thought you guys did a pretty good job. Well, then friends and family began saying to me, you've gotten a ton of publicity, really around the world. I was on the cover of Esquire magazine in London as, the real Anchorman, that there really was a human being behind the parody. And so people began to say to me, you're going to be crazy if you don't take advantage of the hook that this gives you to write a book. Well, I'd written 7 books, but none of them about myself. And so this kind of spurred me, because I'd thought about the idea of doing a memoir, and I just hadn't quite gotten over the hump of actually doing it. And I thought, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, okay, this is the time, this is the reason. The book then began to take on a life of its own. And while I started it out as a sort of an anti-Anchorman, the antidote to what you saw in the movie about Ron Burgundy, because my life and career and approach to journalism, everything about me was quite the opposite of the role that Will Ferrell played as Ron Burgundy. So I started out to tell the story of what the real Anchorman's life was like, this based on this Anchorman, to give people, inside the newsroom, behind the scenes, out on the stories, what it's like to be a journalist in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But as I continued writing the book, in fact, I sent the first draft to my agent, and it was filled with, I thought, very interesting anecdotes, because I have had an exciting, interesting career, covered the space program, all of the Apollo moon launches through Apollo 12. She got on the phone and she said, and it had taken me 3 years to write this, and she said, Mort, I like the book. You've told some interesting stories. It's well written. She said, I'm Jewish. I said, yeah, I know you're Jewish. She said, I never thought I'd be saying this to anybody, but she said, I'm going to say this to you. Your book needs more Jesus. And I knew exactly what she meant, because I grew up in a very staunchly conservative religious home. My father was a minister. His brother, twin brother, was a minister. My aunt was a medical missionary. We had enough clergy in our family to start our own denomination. And what she was telling me was that throughout the book that I had written, parts of my own personal struggle to know truth and to answer the big cosmic questions. Part of the questions that started when I began to look seriously at the way I was raised and the things I'd been taught, and began to have serious questions about whether it was all true or not. It kept popping up in the book, but it was not really an underlying theme. It was just bits and pieces. And she caught that. Susanna Einstein is my agent, and she said, you need more of that. You need to tell more of that story of your personal spiritual struggle to know truth, to answer the big questions. What is life all about? Why are we here? Does life have a purpose? Is there a God? If so, what does it all mean? What is God? And I thought about it, and I thought she's absolutely right, because that story kept trying to bubble up through what I was writing about my career. So I went back and took another 2 years to rewrite and allow that theme to permeate and make its way through the book in a much more open and honest way. So I guess you could say I wrote the memoir twice, 3 years writing the story of my life professionally, and another 2 years tracing my journey of trying to make sense of life.
And I want to get back into that question, but before we go there, you mentioned that this is not your first book. You'd written 7 other books before this, but they were very different. So can you tell me the difference between writing a book about yourself and the other books you wrote, and what they were like, and what the writing process? It sounds like it was more contemporary.
The other books that I've written, except for the one, How to Be as Terrific as Your Dog Thinks You Are, that book did quite well. It's out of print now, but it is still available in an audio version. I should make sure you get some of those DVDs. Except for that book, all of the other books, the other 7 books, were stories about other people. That's what journalists do. And one of the first critiques I got, not from my agent, but from my editor, who was working with me initially and giving me some guidance on how to structure the book. One of the first criticisms that she made, she said, you're telling these stories like a reporter on the outside looking in at your life. I said, well, that's what I've been trained to do. I've been trained as a journalist, and in my practice as a journalist all these years, it's been a matter of staying objective, staying on the outside of the story, looking in and telling somebody else's story, getting the facts as correct, as straight as I can. She said, no. Writing a memoir is exactly the opposite. She said, you have to be totally subjective. It all has to come from the inside. You're not reporting on your life, you're telling your life story. So that was quite a revelation, and required a considerable switch in approach and in thinking about how you write. It was kind of fun once I got the hang of it and realized that I don't have to be objective now. I can just tell things as straightforward and as honestly and from my perspective, and it's okay. I don't have to have to worry about fairness. I just have to worry about being honest.
Well, that's a good point, because the subtitle of your book it's called Anchored, A Journalist's Search for Truth. And you make an important distinction between just the facts, ma'am, and the truth. So what do you mean about a search for truth? Because you would, I think, agree that it's not just adding up all the facts.
That's correct. And I learned that as a journalist. But I think in the human dimension of our lives, aside from the professional, aside from the day-to-day things that we do to make life work, I think there's a dimension of life. I'll call it the spiritual dimension. Other people might have other ways of defining it. It's that intangible. It's that part of life that can't be neatly put into a box of logic and reason. One of the problems I had with the religious training that I grew up with was that some of it didn't make sense. How can a person in this day and age? It was like some of the beliefs that some people seem to have in my own church and in my own background seemed oblivious to the fact that Copernicus had ever existed, that Einstein had ever existed, that these people who had made gigantic discoveries that changed the perception of everything. It was like people had blinders to that. And my feeling was faith does take us into a dimension, certainly, that is beyond reason, beyond facts. But for me, faith couldn't be something that flew in the face of facts and threw out reason. So I had to deconstruct all of the things, or many of the things that I had been taught. For example, I don't believe that a big fish actually swallowed a prophet named Jonah and 3 days later regurgitated him up on the shore, where a tree miraculously grew overnight to give him shade. I no longer believe that Noah actually took all those animals. When you look at the number of species and subspecies in the world today, and the same people who would believe that story is literal historical fact would tell you they don't believe in evolution. So that means that all those species existed at the time of Noah, and it boggles the mind. I can't believe that is historical fact. So I say that to say that I had to deconstruct an awful lot of things that to me defied reason, defied logic. And I had to rebuild my faith and my sense of God and my sense of awe of this universe and the mystery behind all of it. Einstein said, when asked if he was a religious man, he said, there has to be something marvelous behind all of it. And that's kind of where I started. But I thought, some of the explanations that I was given as a child and that I grew up with in our very conservative church and very literalistic church didn't make sense to me. And so I had to reconstruct a faith. Now, granted, my faith takes me beyond what mere facts. Otherwise, faith would have no meaning as a word. And I illustrate it this way. You could give me 50 reasons why I should not logically love my wife. You could give me 50 reasons why I should. And you know something? None of those reasons would matter at all. Because love transcends logic. Now, I think young people who are going into a marriage should approach it logically. They should look at certain things that are reasonable about their backgrounds, about their likes, their dislikes, their similarities. But in the final analysis, you don't build a relationship just because you check off all the boxes. And so I think faith, like love, takes us into a dimension of awareness and of reality, and through meditation and through opening ourselves up to the awe and the mystery of this marvelous universe, faith can move us. But for me, faith could never be something that contradicted common sense and plain facts. So the journalist's search for truth is really talking about my own journey and search for answers to the big cosmic questions. And going back to, I said a few minutes ago, why are we here? Is there a God? Is there a purpose to life? What's it all about?
How did you try and find that truth when you were reporting a story? How did you determine what was the truth of the story, separate from just the facts adding up?
That was always the challenge, and particularly when you were dealing with sometimes conflicting, contradictory, or facts that weren't in sync. But that's what a journalist is supposed to do. It's what a good judge is supposed to do. You weigh all the evidence. It's not easy, but it's the constant challenge of a good journalist to weigh all the evidence, to look at all the information, to listen to all sides, because many stories have more than two sides, and some stories only have one side. But the role of the journalist is to get as much information, valid information, verifiable information as possible, look at it, analyze it, verify it if possible, check it out, and then do your honest best to tell the story based upon your assessment of those facts. That's a lot easier than answering some of these cosmic questions.
Well, it's apparently very difficult, because what would you say, how do you think the media is doing these days with the search for the truth?
Media is such a broad term these days and encompasses so much. And there is no simple one-word answer to it. There are people in media, there are people in journalism who are doing an extraordinarily good job and a courageous job and a fair job. And there are many who pose as journalists who are really nothing more than propagandists for a point of view or political cause. And I think it's unfortunate that it's so difficult for us today to sometimes distinguish. I hate to be an old curmudgeon who looks back to the good old days, but I will say, in all honesty, when I was practicing journalism in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, there was a pretty clear line drawn in television, in radio, in newspapers between news and editorial or commentary. Walter Cronkite delivered the news every night on CBS. And occasionally he had a commentator by the name of Eric Severide, who was very, very good at analyzing and giving opinion. But it was labeled as such. And Cronkite, for many years, was named and voted in various surveys as the most trusted man in America. He was trusted because people knew he was going to delineate and present the facts as fairly as he could. And in my own time in journalism, when I did news, I presented it as straight and as unbiased as it was humanly possible to do. Now, occasionally I would do a commentary, and we would super across the screen commentary. And it was clear that we drew the line. Well, today, when you're watching particularly the cable channels, any of the cable channels, the line has been so blurred that it practically doesn't exist anymore. Everything is commentary. I blame part of that on the necessity of these channels to fill 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, what do you fill it with? Well, the least expensive thing to fill it with is talking heads spouting off opinion. But it has muddied the waters for journalism so that the real journalists, the people who are still trying to tell the truth, tell it straight, they kind of get lost in the haze of all of these opinions and points of view that are being constantly espoused.
Well, you've had the advantage of being in different formats of journalism. Can you talk about the difference for you between being a print journalist, a television journalist, and a radio journalist, and which you'd prefer, if there is one?
Well, it's all medium. That's almost like asking, and I know you weren't asking which was superior, just what are the differences? The difference in watercolor or doing pastels or doing oil painting. It's all art, and it's just a means of using a different medium for the expression. I think the fundamentals of good journalism apply whether you're writing for a newspaper or a magazine or a blog or a book. If it's journalism, if you're trying to get the facts and arrive at the truth, your role and your process is pretty much the same, whether it ends up going out as videotape or film, or off a printing press, or on your computer screen. The medium really shouldn't change the message.
So you saw a lot of changes over the years. Are there any ones in particular that you thought were huge? It's funny, I listened to something the other day about the founding mothers of NPR, and Susan Stamberg and Linda Wertheimer said that they originally weren't allowed on the radio because they didn't have the voice of God, which you talk about. You know, you make a phone call and somebody will say, it's God on the phone, because you have that amazing radio voice. What did you see changes in terms of, you know, you had a female co-anchor, or, you know, what were the big changes that you saw along the way?
Well, that certainly was one of them, the opening the doors for women to participate fully in journalism. And that has happened across the board, not just in journalism, but the glass ceilings. There is still progress to be made. I don't mean to suggest that women have arrived, but enormous progress has been made. And today it's certainly not shocking to see 3 women anchoring the Today Show, with no male co-anchor at all. Occasionally men show up on that show in host roles, but that would certainly have been shocking 30 years ago, 40 years ago, to have seen that. So that's African Americans and Hispanics, just the opening of doors for people who are not white males to assume positions of leadership and prominence in journalism has been a big one. Technology obviously has been huge. When I covered Lyndon Johnson on his 7-nation tour of Asia and the Pacific, ended up at the Vietnam Summit Conference in Manila. I talk about that in the book. I was covering for the ABC radio network. And back in those days, the radio network was still very, very big. And there were a lot of people who, despite the presence of television, still depended on radio to get their news. Farmers out on their tractors and people in their cars driving to work. Still do to some extent, but radio in the 60s was very big. And we sent radio reporters along with the television reporters to cover major stories. And I was with Frank Reynolds, was the ABC White House correspondent for ABC. I was the network correspondent for the radio side. And when I was in Australia, this was at the height of the Vietnam War, and Johnson was very unpopular with a lot of the anti-war people. And there was a protest against the president when his motorcade went through Canberra, Australia. I'm sorry, Sydney. We were in Canberra, but it was Sydney where the demonstration took place. And I was recording all of this mayhem into my microphone, describing what was happening and hearing people yelling and screaming. They were throwing paint at the president's limousine. And I made my way into a police station and was able to feed the material back over a telephone. And by the time it got through the underseas cable, which was the way sound was transmitted in those days back to New York, the quality of it was pretty bad. The television people had to send their film to Tokyo and have it processed and then have it flown back to New York. And so you were always 24, 36 hours or maybe 48 hours between the event and getting the film on the air. Well, now when you consider that if I were covering as a radio reporter, I would have a satellite telephone that would give me instant, high-quality sound contact from any place in the world to any place in the world. And likewise, television, with its satellite coverage and digital equipment and iPhones, everybody becomes a reporter now, and you can get good, right now, real-time signals from almost anywhere in the world that you're wanting to report. So I would say the opening up of opportunity for more people, women and minorities, and the huge changes in technology, and not least of all is the internet. And that has been a huge change, not only in allowing us to get information quickly, but to dispense misinformation and bad information quickly and effectively around the world. So it's a two-edged sword.
Yeah, because it's also the source of a lot of misinformation. It's not edited and quality controlled in the same way that news that goes over the television or the radio would be, vetted, I guess is the right word. So it's a little scarier if you're going to get all your information from the internet.
I like the term you used about vetted, because one of the things that I think has diluted the quality of so much journalism today is that we have lost process, and we've lost process because of our technological capability to do things quickly. Back when I was reporting and when I was anchoring, we'd send a reporter out on a story, and the reporter would come back and they would have 2 or 3 hours to work with a video editor in putting the video together. There would be an editor in the newsroom who would go over the copy with the reporter. And sometimes the news director, assistant news director would get involved depending on the nature of the story. So by the time that story was prepared and the video package put together and it got on the air, it had gone through a vetting process that reduced significantly the chance of misinformation or bias or both getting into that report. Well, now compare that process with today when reporters are out live on the scene, virtually covering every story with no editorial control, no process, no backstop, nobody looking over their shoulder, nobody looking at their copy and editing it. So I think when you look at that reality, the technology, yes, it's wonderful that we can have real-time reporting the way we do, but what you've lost is process. And I think in that we have diluted the quality of much of our journalism.
So many people, have either a cell phone, and so many people have access to internet. And so what do you see as the future of radio in terms of like podcasts and internet and all that stuff? So be a prophet and tell us what you see for the future.
Well, people who have forecast the end of one medium because of the advent of another have almost unanimously been wrong. I can remember when television was going to mean the end of, well, let's go back to radio. I can remember when FM radio was going to mean the end of AM radio because the quality of the signal was so much better. Didn't mean the end of AM radio. What it meant was that all of the music programming would go to FM because of its higher quality, fidelity, and the talk shows and all the talk programming would move over to AM. So it changed the complexion of one medium. FM changed AM, but it didn't eliminate it. I can remember when we were told that television was going to be the end of cable television would be the end of magazines, because now you would be able to get your niche programming, whatever your interest was, the golf channel, the gardening channel, whatever you wanted, to be no need for magazines. Well, it didn't. Magazines actually proliferated, but it changed them. And I think television and radio both changed newspapers, because if you can get the news at 5 or 6 in the morning, by the time the evening paper comes out, it's old news. So it has required newspapers, and they're in a world of hurt, but that's a whole other story about the economics of it. But it has required newspapers to focus more on features, more on local and in-depth stories, some investigative stories, and local sports. A lot of things that it simply changed. It didn't eliminate them, but it changed them. Now, newspapers and all print media these days are having a really difficult time. The internet's been hugely responsible for that, and I really hope that the newspapers can survive. Some of them are doing okay, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, but a lot of the local papers are really in trouble financially, and the internet has had a huge role to play in that.
Well, it's interesting because, when photography came along, they said, well, that's the end of art. And really what it did is it freed up art to do something else. It didn't have to worry about that. And so I can see in your field as well that when different things come up, they allow you to do something different and maybe a little more creative and exciting when somebody else takes over a part that maybe wasn't the part you wanted to do anyway. I invite people to ask questions. I'm having such a good time, but it's not fair for me to hog it. So please, while we're talking, type in your questions either on the side or under the question parts, and we will funnel them to Mort. We do have one here. It says, "Hi, Mort, fellow journalist here. Great to hear you. What are some of your favorite stories or moments of your career? But don't give away your whole book."
Probably my favorite coverage was the space program. I had covered, I worked as a journalist the 4 years I was in the Air Force. I wrote articles and did radio and television for Armed Forces Radio and for Strategic Air Command. And with that background, plus the fact that I've been a pilot all of my life, started flying when I was 15. So ABC assigned me to co-anchor along with a journalist that only the oldest among us will remember Merrill Muller. Red was his nickname. Red Muller was the newscaster on the old Today Show way back when Dave Garroway was hosting the original Today Show. Merrill Muller had a very distinguished career. In fact, he covered the invasion of Normandy with Eisenhower in World War II. So he's, of course, deceased now. He's been dead for quite a while. But Red and I went to the Cape and co-anchored and covered all of the space shots. I was there from Gemini 3 through Apollo 12. Got to know many of the astronauts personally. In fact, just a month ago, I interviewed Jim Lovell for a podcast. And that was an interesting experience. I hadn't seen him for several years, but got to know many of the astronauts on a very personal basis. That was probably the most exciting, people, hard to believe it was 50 years ago now that we put those first two men on the moon, Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. But the excitement, the raw emotion that the entire country felt with that incredible accomplishment, I had never experienced, nor will I probably ever again in my lifetime experience anything quite comparable to that.
I think it's fair to say, based on your conversation and on reading your book, that you have and are still having an exciting life. So what would be your advice to someone who wants to get into television or radio? Would you say good idea, or oh my God, or what would you say to somebody?
Well, I think everybody we should all follow our dreams. And I was very fortunate. I've said that my father was a minister in a very conservative church. But the one thing I will say is that my parents were always very supportive of whatever I wanted to do and very encouraging of me to follow my dream and pursue. Their only request was that I do something worthwhile with my life to make the world better and to help people. And I think journalism is one of many professions where you can do that. Certainly in a democracy, we must have solid, valid information if we're going to make good decisions at the polls and selecting our leadership and in helping shape the policies for our country. Has to be based on information, and it's the journalist's role and job to provide that information. So anyone that wants to get into radio or television, or now with all these new technologies, blogs and podcasts, and some probably that are out there that we can't even imagine right now that will be coming on the scene, I think the fundamentals are always the same. Learn to think, learn to write, learn to speak and articulate what you're thinking. And that's not just true for radio and television, but that's really true across the board for anybody. Somebody once said, if you can't say it, that means you really are not thinking it clearly. So be able to think, be able to articulate what you think, be able to articulate it in print, because even for radio and television, it starts with the word. It has to be put down on as words even before it's spoken. Don't limit yourself in education to just journalism and communications. Those are techniques that you can learn and that you should learn. And I went to a graduate journalism school. I'm not putting that down. I think that's very important. But all of the technical ability in the world to stand in front of a camera or to operate a camera or to learn all of the techniques of journalism are not going to be of that much value if you don't have a broad basic education. Know something about life, know a little bit about all of the important issues, know a little bit about science, because you're going to be covering all of these things as a journalist. And I think the person who goes in to strictly learn to be a reporter or an anchor person or to be on television or radio and without getting a good, broad, liberal education is really shortchanging themselves, and there will be a limitation on where they can go in their career.
But you're speaking to my heart. I have to agree in the importance of a liberal education. I'm so happy that you helped us find the truth and continue to help us find the truth and all the things that you've done in your life and that you were willing to share them with us today and in your book. There's lots of things still in the book. I don't want to give everything away or let you tell everything that's in the book because people need to read it. And it is your voice, and it's good to hear your voice.
One of the things that I'm often asked in interviews is, well, did you find that truth? And that's the last chapter in the book, and I'll just leave it there.
Well, we invite people to come and get a copy of the book, and you were gracious enough to sign them for us. And thank you so much for sharing your evening with us. I don't know what your sign-off was. Can you give us your sign-off?
Well, I could do a Ron Burgundy and say, stay classy, Jacksonville. By the way, I love your bookstore. My wife has been there many times, and we love your bookstore. It's a wonderful, wonderful asset in our community.
Well, thank you. We appreciate it, and we appreciate your being part of it tonight and always. And thank your wife, and we'll find people who are eager to read your book, and we'll marry them up together.
Thank
you. You have a sweet night, and thank you for everybody who joined us. We look forward to seeing you soon, and y'all take care and have a good night. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.